From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Pediatrics Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Pediatrics.
Hi, podcast listeners. This is Dr. Dimitri Christakis, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA Pediatrics. With me, as always, is my friend, colleague, Associate Editor, Dr. Alison Galbraith. Hi, Allie. How are you doing?
Hi, good to be here.
And for those of you that are regular listeners, you know that we have initiated a new format for this podcast where we bring on a leading expert in an important topic and have a dialogue with them using a recent publication in JAMA Pediatrics as a springboard. And today we have Dr. Fred Rivara, my mentor and friend and colleague here at the University of Washington. We're so fortunate to have you with us, Fred. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks very much.
He has his own podcast at JAMA Network Open because, as many of you know, he's editor-in-chief there as well. We are going to talk about injury prevention and particularly gun violence. Allie, what brought this to our attention?
Yeah, so we have two research letters that we're publishing that are on this topic. They're kind of a jumping off point for this podcast. The first one is called Economic Burden of U.S. Youth Violence Injuries. It's by Peterson, and it basically finds that $122 billion is devoted to the fallout from firearm injuries dominated by male firearm homicides. The other research letter is Years of Life Lost to Firearm Suicide Among Young People in the U.S. That's by Garcia. And that also is sobering and finds that 3 million years of life are lost to suicide between 2013 and 2020.
So, Fred, before I get your reaction to these articles, can you tell us a little bit? You've been studying firearms for what now, 30 years? Is that right?
35 years.
35 years. And why don't you tell us about the first landmark paper you did, but you can choose which one you think that is.
Well, the first landmark papers I did was with Arthur Kellerman, my colleague who was formerly at Emory and Uniformed Services University and Virginia Commonwealth University. And we did some case control studies looking at the association of home ownership of firearms and risk of violent death in home, homicide and suicide. Those papers showed that having a firearm in the home was associated with, for young kids, about a 10-fold increase in risk of suicide and about a 3-fold increased risk of homicide. They're all published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and as you can expect, they garnered a lot of attention, some of it from the NRA and the NRA congressional supporters. And that resulted in, fairly directly, something called the Dickey Amendment, which was in 1996, and it resulted in about 20-some-odd year hiatus in federal funding from the CDC, NIH, in firearm research. So it's really a terrible blow to the field. However, things are really different. And, a few days ago, on the 22nd, President Biden announced the creation of an Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the White House. And it's going to be overseen by Vice President Harris and directed by one of the longtime staffers at the White House. In addition, we are having the second National Conference on Firearm Injury Research, and that has, as of Thursday, 660 people coming. So there's been a massive change in what's happened just in the last few years. And it's really in response to the terrible problem that we have of firearm violence. And this one article from the CDC is actually even now outdated, talks about that there were the homicides in 2020, but even in 2021, the homicide rate went up significantly to over 6,900 homicides that occurred in 2021. And we know that the number of suicides to youth has been increasing for about a decade now. And the problem there is certainly related to ownership of firearms.
Fred, so the 35 years ago, you did that study, and those findings are still true today. In fact, they've been replicated over and over.
They have been replicated. And if you look at the relationship between number of firearms in a state, there's a direct, pretty straight line correlation between that and the homicide and suicide rate in a state.
And I think suicide doesn't get as much attention in this regard as it should. I think most people think of guns in the home as being a risk for other people being killed. But in fact, the suicide rate is the bigger one, right? The suicide risk.
Right. And if you look at the data, which is clearly available on the CDC website, that 60% of firearm deaths in the United States are from suicides. In states in the West, it's on the order of 75%. Like here in the state of Washington, it's about 70%. In states like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, it's over that, 75 to 80% of deaths from firearms due to suicide. So it's a really very overlooked, unfortunately neglected area. And for us as physicians, it clearly is in our lane.
What do you think about different strategies to get at that? For example, lock boxes or things like that to restrict if you have a gun in the house to keep someone else, like a kid or teen, from using it for suicide versus other just more broad types of waiting periods or stuff like that?
Well, many interventions are useful. You mentioned the use of lockboxes. So probably the best study on this was done by David Grossman, a colleague here at the University of Washington, and published in JAMA 20 years ago. And it showed in this case control study that he did that locking up firearms decreases the risk of unintentional firearm deaths and suicides to young people by on the order of 75 to 80%.
Wow.
So for youth, locking up is clearly successful. There have been laws around the country that require or penalize parents if the firearm is not locked up and youth get access to it and commit harm. And for those states that have it as a felony, those laws are also associated with reducing the risk of suicide.
So are you in favor of those laws then, Fred?
I am in favor of those laws. One of the laws that is getting a lot of attention nowadays is something called red flag laws or extreme risk protection laws. And these are now available in 21 states and the District of Columbia. And basically, if a person is exhibiting behavior that indicates that they're at risk of harming themselves or others, the family member or the police can go to a judge and ask that the firearm be removed and this person be prevented from buying any future firearms for the next year. And those laws are under a lot of study right now. They are felt to be one of the most promising interventions we have. And there is indication that they are successful in lowering both homicides and suicides. And in terms of homicides, particularly the mass shootings.
Let's talk a little bit about mass shootings, because I think that gets, again, a lot of attention. And to be candid, I think that's a big part of what's putting firearms on the public radar screen. But that also is a very small percentage of the deaths in the United States, right?
That's right. We know in medicine to not practice medicine by anecdote. Unfortunately, the mass shootings are sort of like anecdotes in that they get a lot of attention, but they account for less than 1% of the firearm deaths that happen in the United States each year. And what people need to realize is that we are up to around 48,000 firearm deaths that happen in the United States each year. So we're talking about well over 100 people each day in and day out, that die from firearms. And as I said, 60% of those are suicides, and the rest are homicides, with a few that are unintentional injury deaths from shootings, usually by kids.
It seems like a lot of laws are state-based on this, but then it seems like a lot of states vary in what they're doing. And is that a problem, too, that you can be in one state that has restrictive laws and next door, and then people just cross the border?
Right. It's a mixed bag, Alison, in that certainly there are some federal firearm laws, and certainly there's variation in firearm laws from one state to another. We have porous borders, obviously, between states, and so there can be transportation of firearms across those borders. On the other hand, because we have 50 states, we in fact have 50 different natural experiments, and we can use that information to look at what really does make a difference in terms of firearm deaths. And again, that's been well shown that some states like Hawaii, Massachusetts have quite low rates of firearm deaths because they have fairly restrictive firearm laws. Then you look at places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, they have very lenient firearm laws, and as a result, they have the highest rates of firearm deaths.
So I think it's terrific that research is resuming with federal funding, and hopefully that will be sustained. But even all the things that we know already, all the things you've already shared with us, are so rarely put into federal law anyway, or broadly disseminated. How sanguine are you that new discoveries will really make a difference? Don't we need more political will? And it doesn't seem like all the evidence you've brought to date has created that. Are you optimistic about that or no?
I think it's important for us to try to be positive, be optimistic. I mean, we do live in a country that has the Second Amendment. We do live in a country that has an estimated 400,000 firearms in civilian hands. Those two things aren't going to change. We have to start with that. However, as I said, if you look at the variation in firearm deaths state by state, there are very, very large variations. And that, to me, indicates that laws can make a difference, that they do make a difference in terms of ownership of firearms. They do make a difference in terms of firearm deaths. And I think we as physicians have responsibility to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves about how to ask families about, do they have a firearm at home? And then not to do what the American Academy of Pediatrics says is get rid of the firearm, tell parents to get rid of the firearm, but instead say, all right, well, how is the firearm stored? Is it stored safely or not? And how can we improve firearm safe storage? And view that as a harm reduction strategy, same way as you would counsel somebody who is drinking. You're probably not going to get them to stop drinking altogether, but you can reduce the harm that they might experience by reducing the amount of drinking. Same ways here is we can reduce the risk of harm by making sure firearms are safely stored. Physicians need to be aware of extreme risk protection orders. While they can't, for the most part, in most states, petition for those themselves, they can educate families about that, about the need and the possibility of, if you have a homicidal individual, family member, or a suicidal individual, how to get the guns out of the home. So I think there are many things that we can do.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? So a physician can't invoke a red flag law?
In Maryland and maybe one other state, that physicians are allowed to do that. But even in Maryland, most physicians don't know about it and don't do it. It's usually police that do it. But again, it points out we need to educate physicians about, if you are in a situation where you have a family that falls into the category where extreme risk protection order might be relevant, is to counsel the family about how to go about getting that.
And that would be learning about the laws in your particular state or jurisdiction.
About the laws in your state, and there are, like in the state of Washington, there are websites that give you information about how to apply for those. It's not necessarily an easy process, but there are people that can help do it.
Final question, if you have one, to you, Ali, and then I'll wrap it up.
How effective are things that are done at the individual level, like counseling our patients about safe storage? Or we had a study that we published about an intervention to teach kids not to pick up a gun, and then some of the kids still picked up a gun. So should we be putting our investment into those sorts of things or bigger things?
I don't think there's any evidence that we can see right now about teaching kids not to pick up a gun. I think educating families about safe storage, the data indicate that if you also accompany it with giving out a device like a trigger lock or a cable lock, that increases the likelihood of success in doing that. I do think that we need to look at what we can do larger in our community. Like, for example, our children's hospital here has teamed up with various groups in the greater Seattle area to give away free gun lock boxes to individuals. And those are very popular, and I think those are effective. We studied those and found out that families do use those things.
What about smart triggers, Fred? Why isn't Apple, if you will, come out with an Apple gun or something that, uses your fingerprint and only your fingerprint to allow it to work?
That's a really good question, and I don't think any of us have a really good answer to that. First of all, there's a lot of resistance on the part of gun owners and NRA to do that.
Why?
Well, because they're afraid it won't work at the moment that it's needed. When you're trying to shoot the intruder into your home, they're afraid it won't work. Plus, also, It's just any restrictions on firearms is usually fought pretty vociferously.
Well, Fred, we could talk to you for hours. It's been wonderful to have you, and I hope our listeners learned something. I know I did, and I want to thank you for all the incredible work you've done in this field and all the people you've mentored.
Thanks so much.
This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.